today's episode, I chat with the lovely Ali. Ali is a mum to one little boy named Ollie. And as a first-time mom, Ali knew that she wanted to have a home birth for her first child, and this is the path that she went on to because she wanted to be in a familiar space with continuity of care through her private midwife. Very early on in her pregnancy, Ali started experiencing what will later be diagnosed as hyperemesis gravidarum, which was extremely debilitating in her personal and also professional life. And through this tough time, Ali had to advocate for herself to be recognized as experiencing hyperemesis gravidarum and to get the appropriate treatment so that she could start feeling a little bit better. Ali then takes us through what the rest of her pregnancy looked like. And when it comes to her labor, we know that labor doesn't always go according to plan, and this is what happened for Ali. So she takes us through what it was like to start laboring at home and to have a very long posterior labor which wasn't progressing very quickly, and how she came to the decision that transferring while being stable was the best decision for her at the time. And after a very lengthy posterior labor and changes to Ali's initial birth plan, her baby boy Ollie was born. I think Ali's story will resonate with a lot of first-time moms who feel like they've had to fight their way through motherhood and feel like they haven't been heard despite them telling professionals what is wrong or the help that they need. And in Ali's case, she had to fight for her baby boy in the early hours of postpartum to get him to be diagnosed with an infection. And then she later on had to fight to get the right breastfeeding advice so that her boy could be diagnosed with a tongue tie and get the help he needed so that they could establish breastfeeding. In this episode, Ali is very brave, and I thank her for that because she honestly shares with us how she felt throughout her whole motherhood journey and postpartum. And she also shares with us the mental health struggles that she experienced after her boy was born, and how she accidentally fell pregnant and mentally couldn't continue on with this pregnancy and decided to have a termination. However, deep down, Ali knew that her family wasn't complete yet, and after doing EMDR therapy and working on her mental health, Ali and her husband decided to expand the family and they got pregnant, but it unfortunately resulted in a miscarriage, which could have been simply a miscarriage, but because Ali had a D&C following a miscarriage, it was later found out that she actually had a partial molar pregnancy, which Ali takes us through what it is and how at the time of the recording it is still affecting her life and will affect her future, the desire to expand the family and any future pregnancies that she might have. And we send a lot of positive vibes to Ali. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your honest and raw story with us. You are listening to Cuppa with a Doula. I'm your host, Alicia, exercise physiologist and doula. And every week I chat with a mom or mum-to-be about all things pregnancy, birth and postpartum. The stories you will hear in this podcast are real and sometimes raw, but they are all told without any taboo. So grab yourself a cuppa, put your earphones in, relax, and enjoy this episode. Hi, Ali. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No worries. So do you want to start by introducing yourself? So telling the listeners your name, where you're living, and who is in your family.
I'm Ali, and I live in Hobart, Tasmania, and I have my husband and my just turned 4-year-old in our family.
Amazing. So, did you always want to be a mum, Ali?
Yes, I always wanted to be a mum. I was like the little girl with the dolls and all my babies.
That's so cute. Did you play, mum with her babies, taking them on walks and stuff like that?
Yeah, I had a little pram. I've still even got my little dolly bed. My son now plays with that with his little dolls.
That's so cute. That is so cute.
Yeah.
Did you have younger siblings as well, or babies around you, or not really?
No, I was the youngest, so I actually
Okay.
didn't grow up around babies at all. So that was a big learning curve when I got one of my own.
Oh, that's funny. Wow. I feel like it's a learning curve for everyone. Like, as much as you prepare,
Yeah.
every baby's different, obviously, and you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I wasn't prepared for this.
Yeah, pretty much. My husband had a lot more experience with babies than I did.
Oh, nice. So was he maybe a bit more confident when you got your son, or still not?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
He feigned confidence, and then when it came time to do things like giving him his first bath, he was like, what am I doing?
I mean, newborns are so small, right? They're just this little
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Teeny.
Yes.
I
Amazing.
know.
So when you met your husband, did you talk fairly quickly about, the fact that you wanted to have kids and maybe that he also wanted to have kids at some point?
Yeah, we did. Like in the whole getting to know you period, it just sort of came up naturally. Like, oh, what do you want to do when you're like older? And do you want
Yep.
kids? And how do you see yourself? And we're both very open about the fact that one day we both wanted to have a family, but it was never
Yep.
like too much set in stone, like I have to have a baby.
Yeah.
I just sort of knew I wanted to be done by the time I'm 30. Not that that's happened, but that was only my loose guideline that I had. Other than that, I was relatively flexible.
Nice. And so obviously you didn't have a set numbers of kids, right? Or did you actually have one?
No, like we've never really specifically spoke about numbers. I always sort of had the mind of like 2, and we always sort of said, oh, it'd be amazing to have like 3 or 4 kids and like a big family, but that would always be dependent upon all the other things that comes along when you're a parent, like finances and support and how you, that was all a bit of a maybe, but that was well before we had kids.
Yeah. I feel like before you have kids, you've got like, obviously your plans change, I think, as you get kids and you realize what it involves, and obviously, there's other factors outside of having kids, like obviously, as you said, finance, support, where you're living, logistics, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But so did you plan to conceive your son Ollie when you did?
Yes and no. So I had been hanging out to start trying for a baby for a while. Because I was sort of coming into that time of my life as like mid-20s. My friends are sort of starting to have babies around me, and I was very much wanting to go down that pathway too, but my husband wanted to wait until after we were married. So as soon as we were married, I'm like, right, let's start having a baby. And it took him a couple of months to come around to the idea. I think he wanted to enjoy being married for a little while first. But we ended up conceiving about 6 months after trying, which was about 7 or 8 months into our marriage. Sort of new, but it was my first pregnancy, so I was sort of like, oh, I think I might be, but it wasn't 100% because I had been routinely testing a couple of days before my period each month, and this particular month I had what I later realized was definitely implantation bleeding. And I remember saying to my husband, oh, I think I might be pregnant. I've just had this weird little bit of bleeding. And he was just like, yep, cool. I didn't think much of it. And the next morning I tested positive. I remember telling him in the morning, I'm like, hey, I'm pregnant. And I woke him up and he was like, okay, that's cool, but pregnant people sleep, because it was really early. It was like 6:30 or 7 a.m. He was excited when he woke up, but at the time he was just like, that's cool, like just sleep.
So you'd been waiting for 6 months, or were you over the moon that you were finally pregnant?
I was, but it was also really surreal because I'm like, oh, I haven't missed my period yet. You get
Mm.
a positive pregnancy test, so it feels like everything's changed. But
Yeah.
at that point, really nothing has, unless
Yeah.
you're kind of a week or two post that period and starting to get symptoms. Like I was still no symptoms, felt normal, but I'm like, oh my god, there's a tiny baby in my belly. I remember my first scan, I looked at it, I'm like, oh, it looks like a little dinosaur. So I had I think it was 7.5 weeks. So I had like the
Yeah.
big head and it just had like the little arm stumps. I'm like, oh, it's a little dinosaur.
That's so cute.
Yeah.
Oh, too funny. So, in terms of navigating, scans and birthing options, did you know what options you had, around you, what was available to you?
Being in Hobart, we have very limited options.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a birth centre. There
Mm.
is one in Launceston, but that's a couple of hours drive. And at the moment, and I think it was about the same back when I was pregnant with Ollie, that there was only one midwife running the birth centre. So,
Mm-hmm.
her caseload is quite limited.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Hobart, you have a couple of options through the public system. And you have two private hospitals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of choices. And then there was I think there's 4, and I think it was about the same amount of numbers back then to endorse private practicing midwives who do home
Mm-hmm.
births.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot, but I knew from the get-go that I wanted a home birth because our local hospital system is really under pressure at the best of times.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt hospital is there for when you need it and when you're sick. And I didn't see birth as it is as a medical sickness type thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I saw it as a natural thing that sometimes needs assistance, and that's
Mm-hmm.
when the hospital should come in.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And see, what's interesting is, so you were a first-time mom, which it can sometimes be almost like a deterrent, I think, for first-time moms to have a home birth, because they think, oh, well, I'm not sure, I don't know about birth yet. I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, maybe I could do it, but I might need help, and then I don't have, the help in terms of, pain relief, for example. That's a big one. Yet you just went straight for that option. So that's really interesting.
Well, in my mind, I knew that the only way that I would have continuity of care, which not even in the birthing world, if you look at that in all different aspects of healthcare, continuity of care has better outcomes, then I would need to go with a private practicing midwife.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I wanted that, and I wanted the security of having someone that I knew at such a personal time. And then on the flip side, I'd also heard some pretty horrendous stories from, acquaintances and friends of friends who had birthed in our local hospital system. And I just really wanted to avoid that. As well as, my mum, I guess, could say she's had 2 traumatic births, especially her first birth with an obstetrician in one of the private hospitals could be labelled as quite traumatic. So I really just wanted to avoid that system and be where I felt supported. I think I was just barely 6 weeks when we had our first meeting, and she was like, oh wow, you're really on the ball. Yeah, I was excited. I think it's quite early. I think it's not early in terms of making contact, because some people will make contact and meet with a few midwives and take their time to book in, whereas I was like, I want you live nearby me. Like, I think she was only about 15 minutes drive from my house, and that was like, great, you're really close by if I need you, and that's what I wanted. So, and I got along really well with her at our first meeting, and I felt, like she knew her stuff and knew all the ins and outs and any questions that I could answer. And she was really good with like statistics and risks, and she was also like a qualified naturopath as well. So I had that kind of aspect of looking at things holistically if I needed to. So yeah, I kind of went with her straight away. She had a pretty light caseload, because she was also working within the hospital system casually, and then she just had some other things going on in her life, so she had a bit more of a balance, which I liked as well. And I think some of her other women who were due around the same time as me, they weren't too far away from where I was living, because there is always that risk that you go into labor and your midwife's like an hour and a half away from you at another birth kind of thing. So
Yeah, so you booked your private midwife at 6 weeks, and she was really, really surprised that you were this early. But I mean, you got to be early. What was the first step from there? So because you've got a private midwife and you're not going through the hospital, was she the one that was prescribing all the scans, the blood test, all of that for you?
So to have a private midwife, you do need a referral to be able to access any of the Medicare benefits. So I had my initial appointment with her, got my fees, kind of went through how it all works with home birth and at-home midwifery care. Then I toddled off to my GP and said, hey, I'm pregnant. I want a referral to this midwife. The GP that I saw had never actually referred anyone to a private midwife.
Ooh.
So I had to tell her what to do. But she gave me the form for my first ultrasound, my dating scan, and sent me off for bloods, but put them to be like referred to my midwife and everything. So I went off, booked in for my dating scan, had my first lot of bloods, and continued on with my midwife.
Nice. So you never saw your GP after that initial consult, is that right?
No, I didn't see my then GP after that. I did have to see some after hours doctors, and obviously presented to the emergency department a couple of times because I had hyperemesis. That was caught me a bit blindsided with my first pregnancy. But besides that, I didn't really have to see any doctors until I went post-dates.
Right. Yeah. How was your experience with hyperemesis? Actually, it's just extremely debilitating, obviously, and I'm guessing you would have got maybe dehydrated and just feeling really bad. Like, how was that? How did you manage it, really?
Well, I think it was so bad with my first pregnancy because I had never been pregnant and I didn't know what to expect and what was and wasn't normal. So, you get your first few bits of morning sickness and it's like, oh, yay, I've got symptoms, I'm pregnant. And then it sort of went from being fun and cute to horrible very quickly. I think in the span of a week, it progressively got worse, and it got to the point where I was vomiting so profusely that I wasn't able to take in breaths in these spells, and I couldn't go longer than 20 minutes without vomiting.
Wow.
And I was vomiting bile, and by that point I think I had gone to the after hours the night before and had an injection of Maxilon and got a prescription, and that wasn't working. And it was at that point that I said, I think I need to go to hospital. And so I went to emergency, and, when you present to a public hospital with emergency, you just kind of get whoever. And the doctor I had on then was just sort of like, here's some drugs. I really think you should take ondansetron. It's this new one. It's much more effective, but here's the other drugs for a hyperemesis. And gave me another injection of Maxilon and sent me on my way with this handout and a whole heap of drugs, but didn't give me any fluid. Didn't give me fluids. Didn't give me anything like that.
Oh, okay.
Even though I probably really needed it. But really pushed on dansetron. And I was like, no, something didn't feel right there. So I went on my merry way. I think that was at 8 weeks that I presented to ED. And then around 14 weeks, I ended up back at ED. I wasn't as sick as I was at 7 weeks. I'd been taking all of these drugs and sort of spent my time sleeping, drinking, going to work, sleeping again, and vomiting every half an hour to an hour. But at 14 weeks, I remember saying to my husband and my mum going, I really just don't feel right. Like, I just feel really spacey. So my mum's like, let's go to ED. So I went into ED, got a different doctor this time, a young doctor who had just done his rotation in the pregnancy assessment center. He's like, oh, you've got hyperemesis. You need to come have fluids. Let's check your kidneys. Let's do a scan, do all these things. And so I had IV fluids. He checked my kidneys. They were sort of struggling, so he gave me some electrolytes, which is why I was feeling a bit out of it. Did a bedside scan. I got to see my baby again, which was amazing because I look like a little baby and not a dinosaur now.
Yeah.
And he was a lot more on the ball with everything.
Wow.
So I think, and what he'd said then is like, if you have another baby after this, I know it's a long way away, get onto medication before you get to that tipping point of being so dehydrated.
Right. And so what, did you find a medication that worked for you?
For that first pregnancy, I had a mix of vitamin B6, Maxilon 3 times a day, and then there was I think it's an antihistamine, but it's used as like a sleeping pill, rest of it. Had half of one of those at night and basically sedated myself. I took a whole combination of everything. I basically spent the first trimester really sedated and sleepy just to keep it under control.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, that's what you got to do, because I mean, vomiting every 30 minutes, you're obviously getting dehydrated, and that's not, you know, that's obviously not going to help you to feel any better, and it's just not good for you, for your quality of life, obviously. Wow, that's harsh.
You know, the first trimester is a long time. Like, you still need to function. So I was still working. I couldn't go into a grocery store for majority of my pregnancy because the smell would set me off, even once the hyperemesis had settled down.
When did it go away, or did it get less worse?
It settled down around 21 weeks. By that point, I wasn't vomiting anymore, which was very nice.
Yeah, that's an improvement. But that's a long time, from 7 weeks to 21. That's like 3.5 months. Wow. Oh, that's harsh. Wow. So outside of that, you were obviously doing really well, because you were still working, which is impressive when you've got hyperemesis. Like, you did really well, actually. Wow.
I have very supportive co-workers.
Yeah, that's good. Wow. Did you so obviously when you're feeling really sick, that makes you feel even more pregnant, I feel, because you're like, oh, I've got symptoms, especially in the first trimester. Were you like kind of understanding that you were having a baby soon? You know, I mean, sometimes it can be a bit abstract in the first pregnancy. Like, obviously, you know, you're going to give birth, but it still seems like it's in a really long time, and it can be a bit abstract sometimes.
It was a bit abstract at times. I think when I was having the really uncontrollable spells where you're literally vomiting so hard that you cannot get a breath, I would have a moment of going, I cannot do this. Like, how am I going to do this for another 30 weeks? Yeah. But once it did start settling down and got managed, it was a lot better. But in those moments, I think anyone else who's had hyperemesis would understand this. It's just, you just don't know how you'll do it, because it's terrifying, vomiting so much that you cannot breathe. I remember my husband sitting there like rubbing my back, just feeling so helpless because he couldn't do anything to stop these episodes.
That's just totally crazy, the way some women get hyperemesis and others don't, and some people get morning sickness, others don't. I don't know if there is any predisposition, I guess, to hyperemesis. I've never looked into it. I know once you've had it once, you're likely to have it for your subsequent pregnancies. Is that right?
Yeah, if you've had it once, you're more likely than you're not to have it with any future pregnancies.
Yeah, that puts a bit of a dark spell on it a bit, because you're like, okay, well, if I want another one, I've got to go through that. But I mean, as you said, as the doctor said to you, you'd have to get medicated pretty much straight away to take the edge off. I mean, if it even works, obviously.
Yeah, so apparently if you catch it before you start getting dehydrated and really kind of malnourished, those things sort of trigger it. And spur it on, it's a lot more manageable to keep under control. Like, you still won't feel great, but you should hopefully avoid hospitalization. Yeah.
In the lead up to your second trimester, did you do any birth education? I'm sure your midwife would have educated you around, preparing you for birth, but did you do any other birth classes birth preparation?
No, I didn't really do any classes. I read a few books, like Inaya Gaskin's book, Guide to Childbirth.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, read that one,
Yep.
and I forget the other one. I watched a lot of documentaries. I watched a lot of birthing videos, and just had a lot of conversations with my midwife.
Nice. How was your husband about a home birth? Was he on board straight away? Like you didn't have to convince him at all?
No, I didn't have to convince him. He was like, okay, cool. That's what you want to do? Sure.
Wow. See, that's good. I mean, so he wasn't too scared or apprehensive about seeing you, experiencing contractions and all of that. He was quite ready to jump in and be, hands-on with you.
Yeah, he was really excited. He wanted to be like, hopefully jump in the birth pool and help catch the baby.
Oh, cute. Oh,
Yeah.
nice. Oh, that's so good. So how was your third trimester? You didn't have hyperemesis too much in the third trimester, is that right?
Yeah, I was sort of fine after that. After around 21, 22 weeks, it did settle down. And then besides like the aches and pains and just being large and uncomfortable, I didn't have any issues. I didn't have any gestational diabetes. I didn't have any group B strep or anything like that. Just aches and pains and just getting really large and round.
Yeah. So had your midwife told you about what could happen if you needed to transfer or if you wanted to transfer to a hospital?
Yeah, we spoke about it, and it was mostly like if I transferred, she would just be a support person and she could help me make decisions and be that informed support. But she would no longer be my primary care provider. They don't have admitting rights here in Hobart, which is unfortunate. And we spoke a lot about positioning and spinning babies and all of those things, and just a lot of things just about these are things you can do to help, and just the fact that birth can kind of go all different ways and just be open to how things play out.
Yeah. Did you have a birth plan or birth preferences that you had discussed or written with your midwife?
Yeah, they were mostly along the lines of delayed cord clamping, skin to skin, that golden hour. What else was it? Ideally being in the water and not really like having coach pushing. That was mostly around the baby, not so much for me.
Yeah.
I think.
I feel like that's pretty standard. We put, even when a baby's not born, we put them first before us.
Yeah.
And then that's motherhood
definitely
defined.
Yeah.
So how were the weeks leading up to your birth? How did you feel? How was your body going? Did you have any Braxton Hicks, any pre-labor contractions and that?
No, I never really had Braxton Hicks. I'll get like occasional really sharp tightening pains if I was being really active.
Yep.
But I remember being really confused. Like, I thought I would get all these practice contractions and I didn't. I was just someone who didn't really get Braxton Hicks. I was just mostly very uncomfortable, and it was summer and it was hot.
Ooh.
And then I had everyone saying to me, like, oh, you're so large, you're going to go early. And I'm going, oh, it'll come when it's ready. But everyone's had it in my head that you're going to go early. Like, you'll be amazed if it comes before Christmas, because it was due 4th of January.
Oh, yeah, right.
So I was around 38 weeks Christmas time.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of that comments from people, but mostly I was just uncomfortable, which I think most people are at that point.
Yeah. And so can you tell us what happened on the day before or the day of your labour beginning?
So much to everyone else's disappointment and calls, I did not go early. Ollie decided to stay in until 42 weeks. So, yeah.
So that's mid-January at this point, right?
It was, like 17th of January, I think I went into labour. He was born the next day.
Oh, wow. Oh, there's always so much pressure when people say, oh, you're going to go early, and you think, oh, I hope so. And then you don't. And I feel like that's really hard mentally to go past your due date and then to go another 2 weeks, like, how did you feel mentally? Were you just, get this baby out of me now?
Yeah, pretty much. But I was also like, I was sort of like, why is he not coming yet? But then my nan, her babies all came late, and her first one was 42 weeks. So, you know, my nan's going, he'll come when he's ready. And
Yeah.
I just sort of had that mentality, and like clinically we were all fine, but I had stopped working at 38 weeks because no one would let me do anything because they were worried I would go into labour and have a baby, and here I was 4 weeks later still pregnant. So
do you know what's funny I find is when because I had that when I was pregnant, so I think I went to the hairdresser and I was 39 weeks or something. And then she said to me, oh, when are you due? And I said, oh, anytime now. And she said, and she looked at me like I was about to give birth on the chair right this second. And I'm like I'm not in labor. I'm fine. I'm just waiting. But she, like, the eyes just went like, I'm like, it's not a disease. Like, I'm not going to contaminate you. And even if I was in labor, like, it can take a really long time, to go from pre-labor to active. So I'm fairly confident even if I had contractions right now, I wouldn't give birth on your hairdressing chair. But the looks, I'm like, okay, sure.
Yeah, it doesn't happen like in the movies.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, people think, oh no, if you're like past, 37 weeks, if you say, oh, I could give birth like any day now, they think you're going to give birth like in 1 second, like it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Probably not. I mean, it could be good if it was. It would save us a lot of pain and aches, but no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So how was the 17th then? Did you wake up with contraction or cramping?
No, I sort of woke up on the 17th and gone, oh no, I'm still pregnant. I had an appointment booked with an obstetrician at the hospital just for a well check and to kind of start talking about induction offers, because by that point I was 42 weeks. And I was already past what, the hospital deems needing to be induced. They induce at 40 plus 10. And I was over that.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well, we'll go to this appointment. So we waddled in, went to the appointment, had a scan. Baby was good. I was good. Blood flow was good. Fluid was good. Like nothing was wrong. Yeah. He was just posterior, not out. He wasn't even measuring huge. I think he was they measured him at 3.8 kilos, which at 42 weeks is pretty average. Like, it's not crazy big, not small, like good. So they weren't worried or anything like that. But, by their standards, let's get baby out. And so they pressured me to book an induction the next day. And with a lot of tears and stress, I went along with it. And I just thought, well, when I get home, I can talk to my midwife and we can always cancel it. But while I was there, they kind of put a lot of push for me to try and do something. So I reluctantly agreed to a stretch and sweep. And after that, I remember feeling quite wet, like leaking, but everything kind of leaks and is quite moist when you're pregnant. So I wasn't really sure what was going on. But by the time we got home, we sort of relaxed, and my husband had looked up pressure points because one of the midwives at the hospital, she had taken me a walk through the birthing suites, because that was one of the conditions of me booking in for an induction, was that I got to have a look around because I'd never seen it before. So she had shown me around and she's like, you guys should try some pressure points when you get home. Like, what else have you tried? And that was like one thing that we hadn't. So we went home and we Googled that, and he did the pressure points, and my waters broke all over our bed. Like, profusely broke everywhere.
Insane.
Yeah. So they worked. Don't know whether it was a stretch and sweep or the pressure points, but it happened.
He needs to tell us what the point was at this point, because obviously everyone wants to know now, where is this pressure point?
It was one on my ankle. It was around my ankle. So if you Google a pressure point to induce labour around your ankle, it was that one.
Okay, noted. Thank you.
Yep.
So your waters broke. So now you know. Now you know your waters have broken. Are you getting contractions?
No. So I frantically rang my midwife going, my waters have broken. And she's like, are you okay? I'm just like, I'm just so happy. And she's like, go and have a shower, pop a pad on, and have a nap. Like, that was her word. She's like, have a shower, have a snack, pop a pad on, go have a sleep.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay. Bit of a buzzkill. So I went and I had a shower and I had a snack, and there was just no way I was sleeping. I was too excited. But I had to lay down, and within an hour I started getting mild contractions, and it was really exciting. Yeah. So my waters broke around 3, and by 5 o'clock I was in active labour.
Oh, wow. You would have been very excited at this point because you've been waiting this long.
Yeah, it was so good. My husband was even more excited. Like, my waters broke and he was in the next room, and I just yelled out to him like, oh, I've even just peed myself and my water's broken. And he came in and I sort of stood up and just like more of it released. There was a gush, and he just left the room. He ran, didn't bring me a towel or anything like that. He just started filling up the birth pool.
Oh,
I'm like,
nice.
hold on, like, can I have a towel? Like,
but see, that's
that was
so
his first thought.
proactive.
I need to prepare the pool.
Yeah. See, that's so proactive. I mean, towel would have been great, but he's already thinking ahead. That's great.
Yep.
Love it.
I think he thought, like, because my waters are broken, the baby was coming like any second.
Well, yeah, because it's like in the movie, it just happens in like 1 second, you know.
Yeah.
Right. So when did your midwife come to your house then?
I think it's about 9 o'clock.
Mm-hmm. So you were labouring
I had
between...
been texting her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. So how did you find active labour in terms of coping? Was it manageable still for you?
It was quite manageable. It was sort of like, it really sucked in the moment of the contraction, and that was sort of like making me not be able to talk through them. But when it passed, it was just like, I felt great. I felt really calm and relaxed and happy and really excited. So yeah, I think it was about 9, because it was by that point I couldn't talk through the contractions, and they were 1 minute long, 5 minutes apart, kind of thing, that my midwife came and my other couple of support people came.
Nice. And so what happened after that? So your midwife is here, you've got your support people either here or on their way. How did it all go?
I jumped in the birth pool and I laboured in the birth pool for a very long time. Yeah. And I started having really horrible back labour. Like, we knew that Ollie was posterior, so that didn't come as a surprise. But I'd wriggle and I'd move and in the pool, and I couldn't really get comfortable, and nowhere really felt that great. And then the back pain would kind of come and go. So my midwife wasn't too concerned, but then nothing really was progressing. And I'd sort of get urges to get up, and then I'll go to get up, but then the back pain would be so bad, so I'd keep leaning forward. Eventually, though, I did get out in the pool because I felt like I was getting urges to push, and I was sort of on the couch and just moving. And I think it was around 7, so I actually laboured all night. I remember, like, my midwife having a nap on my lounge room floor, and my second midwife sitting there knitting. And one of my support people was pregnant herself. She was like 22, 23 weeks pregnant, so she was asleep on my couch at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then around 7, I was starting to push. Like, I kept getting these urges to push that would kind of come and go. And my midwife was like, well, let's just try pushing and seeing what happens. And once I started pushing, everything slowed down. So, yeah, my contractions slowed down. I was like, oh, okay, this is weird. And as a first-time mum, I'm like, oh, what's going on? My midwife's like, look, you know, sometimes it's taking a while. Sometimes with a posterior baby, they can press on nerves that kind of make you feel like you need to push, but it's not quite in the right spot. And she was getting worried about my cervix swelling because he was quite low down. And I was fully effaced, but I wasn't dilating. So she's like, look, you know, it's been all night. Let's lay in this position where you're like head down, lots of pillows, like try and keep your bottom up and stuff to try and keep him off your cervix a little bit. So it didn't swell, and just have a break, go have a nap and try and sleep, and we'll reconvene when things pick back up. And I'm like, okay. So they left around 7 a.m., 8 a.m. and Jessie and I went to bed, and he slept. I tried to sleep on and off, but once everyone had left, and I think about an hour later, once I stopped pushing, things ramped back up, and the back labour was so intense this time. And I got in the bath and I was just leaning forward in the bath with the water from the bath spout just blasting on my lower back because it just hurt so bad, every contraction in my back. And then around midday, I rang my midwife going like, this hurts so bad, like, can you come back? And so she came back and she's like, okay, things have picked back up. You've got epic back labor now though. It says, you know, baby's still posterior. So then she checked my cervix and I had only dilated up to like 2 to 3. I was still fully effaced. And by this time it's midday, like it's coming on 24 hours from when my waters broke and I'd not really slept and it was very hot. And she said, you know, I think at this point it might be an idea to transfer to the hospital. You're clinically fine. You're just having a long labor, which is completely normal with posterior babies for them to take a while and, you know, first time mom and all of that. But I don't want to keep you here if you're getting tired and then it become an emergent situation that you can't do it and you need some support. So let's go to hospital. We could give you, like, if you're comfortable, you can have like a really low epidural just to try and get some more sleep, or you can have some gas or some drugs that I can't give you here. And you've just got some more support there to help give you those tools to keep through a long labor. I'm like, yeah, cool. I'm happy with that. I'd rather transfer now when things are clinically stable, but we have those signs that I could need some support rather than stay home. So she made the calls to the hospital to say, hey, we're coming in. And ironically, like, I was already on the books anyway, booked in for an induction that we had forgotten to cancel. Going, you know, I've actually been in labor all night. They're like, oh, okay, cool. We'll see you soon. And then we had to drive into the hospital. And in the drive from the hospital, things ramped up even more. Like, I was just so unhappy in the car. And my husband's going, oh, okay, things are happening now. Because I'd been quite calm until that point, and when I got in the car, like, it went out the window. There was no calm.
Yeah, that car ride would have been horrible. Did you still have the back pain at that point?
I did, but I was having contractions in the front as well. So I remember kind of being in the front passenger seat and going, I'm sorry, and like had my leg up on the dashboard and being in like some weird position, like the seat all the way back, going, if a cop pulls us over, hopefully they'll forgive me.
Yeah, I'm sure they will understand the situation. No, don't even need to talk at this point. Yeah. So how was the transfer when you arrived at the hospital, actually? So obviously your private midwife became a support person and you were treated by other midwives. Is that right? The hospital midwives?
Yeah, so getting into the hospital was quite easy. I remember being in the elevator and there was like 3 little elderly women in there and I had my pillow and I had biggest contraction. I just screamed into my pillow and these little elderly women are going, it's okay, you can do it, sweetheart. And I'm just like screaming, because that's like the last thing I wanted to do was have an audience to me being in the throes of labor. And I kept having all these really intense contractions and just stopping in the hallway and screaming into my pillow. And I got to the pregnancy assessment center and they took one look at me and they're like, come with us. Just swept me straight through to a delivery suite. And my midwife was already there and she knew the midwives on and introduced me. I don't even remember her name. And like, you know, go have a shower. Like, it's really hot. Go have a shower and we'll set things up here. So I jumped in the shower and I remember sitting on the shower chair and leaning forward and having the water and just that being so good. But I remember at that point just sobbing because it just hit me how tired I was and how much the back pain hurt. I said to my midwife, like, why is this hurting so much? Because it had gone from being this lovely oxytocin-filled labor to just being really, really intense, and I wasn't getting that relaxed high feeling between contractions. And she said, it's just because you're really, really tired, you know.
Wow. Did you get any epidural or any pain relief to give you some rest and give you a bit of a break?
So I really wanted to stay in the shower, but because I was 42 and 1 days at this point and my waters had been broken, they're like, you need to come and have some monitoring. And I hadn't had a Doppler check for a while, so I was open to a little bit of monitoring, and I'm like, okay, just for a little bit, and then I'm getting back in the shower. Like, this is good. And so I went with the midwives, got on the bed, they put the monitor on my belly, I was contracting, the OB came in and was like, hey, you know, we've got to do some monitoring and stuff. I'm like, okay. And I was rolling around and like, can you hold still? Like, we keep losing the trace. I'm like, no. So they offered me the gas and I initially declined. And then the OB asked if she could do a vaginal exam, like to check if I was dilating. And I'm like, yep, sure. It's been a little while. I feel like things are happening. So she checked me, and in the drive from home to hospital, so about 40 minutes, I'd gone from being like a 3 to a 5, almost a 6. So things had picked up, which is great. But then she proceeded to put her hand further up and tried to break my waters. And I screamed and kind of did some weird contortionist movement up the bed. And she removed her hand and goes, oh, I thought I felt some hindwaters. And my midwife and the hospital midwife look at her and go, her waters have been broken for over 24 hours. And she was just like, oh. And so then the hospital midwife was like, take the gas. And so I started trying the gas, and they kept putting it up because I was laying on my back trying to keep still for the monitoring, but I was having awful back labor, and laying on your back just made it worse. So I would breathe in the gas, and then I did not like how that made me feel. I get really, really dizzy. And then it started making me get really nauseated. And I kept saying, no, like pushing it away each time I had a contraction. They're going, no, take it. I'm going, no, I can't. And then I threw up everywhere all over them. And they're like, oh, okay, you actually can't have the gas. And they took it away. And by that point, I'm crying, going, I really want an epidural now so I can have a sleep. And then just like in the movies, though, the anaesthetist walked in and she's like, I'm here. And I'm like, thank you. So I had the epidural. And that took away my back labor.
Oh,
and I still felt all the contractions in the front. Everything, like I felt everything in the front, but there was no more like pain in my back. There was just like tightness. And that was like such a huge relief. And I sort of rolled over and I got a little bit more comfortable. Yeah, so that was nice at that point.
Wow. I can't believe the obstetrician did not even ask about breaking your waters and just literally went for it. And I'm sure
there was no like, hey, I'm just going to do this. It's just, she did it.
Like that's already not ethical to not ask for consent to do something like, yes, you've given consent to a vaginal examination. You didn't say, yes, also please break my waters, which have been broken for like 24 hours. And also like, I'm sure your midwife would have been, giving a handover, like saying, what the situation was. And like she should have known your waters had been broken anyway. Wow.
Yeah. And like I hadn't met this obstetrician, and the most of our conversation was like, hi, how you doing? Oh, okay. Can I do a vaginal exam? So I was like,
great.
Hi, let me stick my fingers inside you that I've never met before, which is totally different to having your midwife ask for consent that you've known for 9 months at this point, going, are you comfortable with me doing a vaginal exam? Like, where are you comfortable with me doing it? Do you want to do it here on the floor, on the couch, on your bed? Like, where do you want it done? And completely different scenarios.
Yeah. And see, that's something you just touched on before, the continuity of care and knowing who is caring for you. Like, obviously, you knew your private midwife and she was there all along. And obviously, you were really comfortable when it came to vaginal examination, something really intimate. And yet this OB, from the hospital, I mean, that's the reality for some women. They cannot even get into a midwifery group practice. So they get whoever is there. And you literally meet the obstetrician as you're in full-blown labor. And as you said, the conversation goes, oh, hi, how you going? My name is blah, blah, blah. I'm the OB. Can I stick my fingers inside of you, basically? Yeah, but that's the reality of the system, I guess, for some people. And so how was the epidural? So you were feeling contractions, but did you get a bit of sleep, a bit of rest maybe?
No, I just sort of remember like closing my eyes and kind of getting back into that birthing room and calming down. And then I heard whispering. I heard a lot of whispering and little and nods and stuff amongst the midwives, like my own midwife and the hospital midwife. And then they sort of roused me, and the obstetrician came in and said, your baby's showing signs of distress. I think we need to do a C-section at this point. And I kind of had just sort of come, like, opened my eyes. I had almost been asleep, and I just sort of look at her. I'm like, oh, okay, that's nice. Can we do that in an hour or two after I've had a nap? And she just kind of stood there kind of gobsmacked and looked at me like, what did you just say? And I remember the hospital midwife was having a little giggle, and my husband was just out of it at this point. And then my home birth midwife was just like, looks at the OB and she's like, let's just have 5 minutes to have a chat, okay? And she sent them all out. And then she explained, because I'd had the epidural, they started a really, really, like, the lowest of low dose Pitocin, just to keep the contractions going in a regular pattern, because the epidurals can mess up your contraction patterns. And when they did that, Ollie had distressed quite badly straight away, so they had to stop it. Like, he had barely had Pitocin for like 2 minutes. Wow. So she said, you know, he's fine at this point. You guys are clinically fine, but at this point, we don't know what's going on inside. You're having a long labor. We could try waiting and letting your epidural wear off and trying some other things, and, you know, maybe ending up having an assisted delivery. But you could try and do all these things to have a vaginal delivery, but have a baby that comes out with low APGAR scores and needs help. Or we can play it safe. We can do the C-section and see what's going on with baby and bring baby out in before he's really unhappy. And as a mum, like, you hear that, as much as you don't want to have a major surgery, you go, of course, take my baby out, like, get my baby safe. So I agreed to the emergency cesarean, which for an emergency happened almost 2 hours later after being called.
Yeah, the sense of emergency is depends on, you know, the definition by the person, really. What I find really beautiful is your private midwife explained to you, because at this point you've been in labor for, like, you know, more than 24 hours. You're exhausted, and also, you know, you're not expected to understand, you know, everything that's happened to you, and so I find it really beautiful that she explained what the OB should have explained to you, actually, which is giving you the reasoning as to why an emergency C-section was she thought required, you know, like explaining the whole, you know, with the epidural, this happened, and, you know, right now it's okay. But, you know, I feel like, you know, private midwives are amazing at that, because they want to give you the information so you can make an informed decision. And I feel like sometimes, and it's not just to say all the hospitals are the same, but sometimes in those situations, some, let's say, medical professionals can just go straight to the point. Oh, we need to do an emergency C-section, but they're not actually telling you why. And you just go, oh, okay, well, it's an emergency. My baby needs to come out. Yes, let's do it. But you don't actually know why. And sometimes if you just, you know, and you don't know to ask sometimes, because, you know, you're sleep deprived, you're exhausted, you know, you're in pain. Now it's not the time. Like, if they give you the information, it's better than you having to think about the questions to ask to get that information. So it's really beautiful that your midwife was there and she could actually explain that to you, so you could understand what was happening and you could be a part of it rather than just being cut, really.
Yeah. I think that's the thing with private midwives, is that they see so many more natural physiological births that they can kind of see when things are maybe not going quite right before it becomes a huge emergency.
Yeah,
and they can have a good insight to make those calls of going, well, do we step in now or do we push it a little bit more and potentially have this disaster situation?
Exactly. Was your husband allowed in the theatre with you?
Yeah, so he was there when I had my epidural, and then while they were prepping me for theatre, one of the midwives took him and gave him scrubs and helped him get all ready. He could walk me to the theatre door, but whilst they got me on the table and set up with some stuff, he wasn't allowed in there, and then he was allowed to come in while they're bumping up my epidural. So I don't really know what happens there, but he got to be right next to me, and my hospital midwife was just next to him as well, and she was there, and she was really more of a support for my husband at this point, I think. So
yeah. And so how was the C-section? Was it a good experience for you?
Yes and no. I think the obstetrician didn't make it a great experience, but some of the other people in the room did. So the anaesthetist was bumping up my epidural, and he was lovely because they have to check whether you're numb, and he had ice, and he's going, I'm really sorry, I just need to put this really cold ice on you. And I'm going, actually no, that feels really great, it's really hot, like, can you just do it a little bit more? And he's like, yeah, sure. So he put some more ice on me to cool me down, and the obstetrician was really impatient, and she was going, can I cut? And he's going, no, yes, she's fine, just wait, just give it another couple minutes. But on the flip side, I was saying to obstetrician when they were washing me with the chlorhexidine, the pink stuff, going, oh, that really burns, when they were washing like my private area. And she's just sort of like, oh, is it? And just really casually, like, kind of brushing it off, I guess, because my epidural was going to kick in and then I wouldn't feel it.
Yeah.
And I later found out that I was quite allergic to chlorhexidine, and I had, like, my skin was all peeling off in that region, which was not fun. And then there was also, and I don't know who gave consent for this guy to be in there, but I remember giving consent to the female paramedic student when I was in the delivery suite, but then there was a male paramedic student. They'd swapped over at some point, and my husband said, I think Guy did give him permission, but he was there to watch the birth. I don't know why a paramedic needs to see a C-section, but he was there. And I remember when Ollie was born and they'd taken him out of me, and I was looking over at my husband to see his reaction. We looked at the baby. The paramedic student was like over in the side, and he was sobbing, like crying. And he had said to my husband afterwards, he's just like, that's the first baby I've ever seen born, and it was beautiful. Like, thank you for letting me watch it.
That's really cute.
Yeah, so that was nice. Like, a room full of strangers, but then there's this young paramedic student, just a man crying at the birth of my child. Yeah.
Oh, that's, and I mean, that's really good that you were happy to have students around, because it really helps when, you know, students can watch you know, labor, birth, and they can really understand. You know, obviously it's better than just reading textbooks, right? When you actually see you know, birth happen and a C-section, you know, it's great. And yeah, that would have probably shaped his whole, like, you know, study and career from there on. Like, wow, what a life-changing moment for him.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So how was the aftermath of the C-section? So was Ollie taken after so you could get sewn up? Or sutured,
no, so he got pulled out, and I remember the obstetrician, like, when she cut me open and she was fiddling around, she saw him and she's like, oh, that's why you're not coming out. He had his cord, it looped around one shoulder, went behind his neck, and then looped around another, like a backpack, and then being posterior. The general theory was because I didn't have the waters to kind of push in and help the cord slide and wriggle, and it was so wrapped around him and the position he was in, they were assuming that when he went down, he would come back up because he didn't like the pressure on his cord. That was the general theory. But he came out, he was pink, he was screaming, he had APGARs of 9, he was fine. They cleaned him up, my husband cut the cord, and then they put him on my chest all wrapped up, and he sat there and he kept trying to latch onto my nose. So as soon as we got to recovery, the midwife's like, do you want to feed him? And I'm like, sure. And I had never breastfed before. Yep. And I'm trying to get him to latch, and he couldn't latch. And I couldn't feel anything because I was still numb from the spinal. So the midwife physically helped get him on my breast, and he was sucking and nursing, and we thought all was well. And we went back to the room and we had some skin to skin. But he was born at 8 p.m. We got back into the room about 9:30. My mum was there, my husband was there, and then by about 11 o'clock at night, my husband was asked to leave because it was after visiting hours. So I think Ollie hadn't even been born for about 3 hours by the time they asked him to leave.
That's brutal. Like, I know they've got rules, but I mean, we all know that sometimes rules can be bent if if you ask her, if you like kind of say, look, I mean, the birth happened like 2 hours ago, really, like, can you make an exception?
Yeah.
Wow.
And like the mum in the bed next to me, she was there for her second cesarean for her second child, and that was her last night there. So she was doing really well, and she's just like, your husband could have stayed the night. I don't care.
Yeah.
You know, she was really lovely. She was a big support that first night because no one told me what to expect after a cesarean. So after my husband was asked to leave and I was left alone with Ollie, like I didn't even get to dress him the first time. The midwife that was assigned to my room on the wing dressed him, swaddled him, put him in the bassinet, and I couldn't reach him. And he was really unsettled, you know. He was still in that new period. He was congested because of the cesarean and not having the pressure to squirt stuff out his nose. So he was crying and all of that sort of stuff, and I couldn't get him because I was still numb. So the lady in the bed next to me, she got him out of the bassinet because the midwives were taking ages to come back to get him for me, and gave him to me so I could cuddle him and settle him and stuff. And then I think at that point, that's when it hit me and I started crying because I was sort of tearing up going, I'm sorry, like, I'll get you soon, like, I can't get you. And I was already feeling like a bad mum because he's right there and I physically cannot get him. And she was lovely. She's like, it gets better. Like, I'll warn you now, tomorrow, that first day is going to be hell. It's going to suck, but take the pain relief. I think she told me to ask for ibuprofen suppositories as well, but I left my mind, and it came back later, like remembering this thing. I'm like, oh, I should have asked for that. And she kind of told me what to expect, which was really, really nice to hear that from another mum who had experienced that when no one else had just told me anything. It's like, oh, here's your baby. The baby's out. You just had major surgery. Off you go. Yeah.
So what was the next day like for you, pain-wise and also mentally, I guess?
Mentally, I think I sort of started dissociating at this point because I had woken up Thursday morning and it was now Saturday morning, and I had been in labour Thursday night, and then I'd had surgery, and I think by this point I'd had maybe 8 hours in total broken sleep over that time. But I remember the midwife coming in at about 7:30 going, hey, we need to get you up to have a shower in about an hour. I'm like, just doing the math in my head, and I just pulled out my phone and rang my mum, who's a nurse, and said, can you come in? And she's like, yeah, I'll be there. And so she came in, and her first hold of my son was holding him while I got out of bed for the first time after surgery to go have a shower. And the midwife kind of helped get me out of bed. I remember being really annoyed with her because she didn't use the back of the bed to help me sit up. I had to kind of like push myself up, and I remember it just being excruciating, and I couldn't stand up properly. And she did say, oh, you know, you're going to be hunched over, like things are going to feel tight. And I just shuffled to the shower, and she just kind of like handed me a towel and kind of left me to it. And I just remember being like hunched over under the shower in the hospital, just going, how am I meant to wash myself? Like, I can barely stand up. And the other thing that stood out to me was this was the first time I would see my body post baby, as well as having major surgery. I remember looking in the mirror, and I was still covered in like the pink chlorhexidine, and I was like hunched over, and my belly was all squishy and like saggy. Like anyone who's had a C-section knows that it's kind of more like popping the balloon rather than letting it deflate. So that had done that, and just being really confronted by that. I think as a first-time mum, you don't really know what to expect, like to see in the mirror after having a baby those first few times. And I remember being alone for that and just being in the shower and kind of having a little cry going, this sucks. You know, and I ended up calling the bell going, I need you to shower me. Like, I can't do this. And so she gave me a quick hose down and stuff, and then I shuffled back to my bed and got back in, and I don't think I really moved again after that throughout the day, which wasn't ideal because they do need to check your urine output after having a catheter. And that afternoon, my private midwife had managed to get a shift in the hospital, and she got herself assigned to me. And I did my second urine output amount, and she looked at me and she's like, you're barely passing this. Like, you know, she was like questionable whether to pass me about not retaining fluid. And I think it was because I was just so out of it. I probably wasn't drinking enough water. And then I also wasn't getting up and moving, and I wasn't drinking because I was in so much pain.
Wow. Did you take the pain medication relief that they offered you? Did you get, you did get offered some, right?
Yeah, like as a routine, they would come around and give it to me like 4-hourly or whatever it was, and I'd just take it. But I didn't feel like it did anything.
How was breastfeeding after having a C-section? As you said, you were in an immense amount of pain, and then you're trying to also breastfeed. How was that?
So my mum had kind of helped me in the morning, like with pillows and things like that. And then when my home birth midwife had come in for her shift that afternoon, she's like, here, and she showed me how to lay down and latch him and nurse. But no one really kind of sat with me to check how he was actually feeding. I think people would just see me with him there, and he seemed to be suckling, so everything was fine. But because I wasn't changing his nappies, they were either being done by my husband or a nurse or anything. No one really picked up the fact that his output was going down. So come Sunday, which was 48 hours post-birth, he became really, really distressed and would not leave my nipple and was tearing me to shreds. And at this point, I really lost it and had a mental breakdown and started screaming at the midwife saying, you're torturing me. Like, I've not slept in days. My baby's really unsettled. Something's wrong. And they're going, no, it's just a 2-day cluster feeding. Like, he's fine. It's normal. You just need sleep. And my mum tried to help. She took him for a little walk around the wing so I could try and lay down for an hour. And even that didn't help. And it was later that night that a midwife came in, and I had been screaming at the afternoon midwife going, my baby's really hot. Like, he's got a fever. And she's going, no, he's overdressed for summer. And I had said to her, like, well, I didn't dress him. You dressed him. And she's like, just take some layers off, which I did. But these other midwives came on, and I was sobbing. I was a mess. And the midwife, they did their first round, and she looks at me. She's like, that's the worst latch I've ever seen. I think your baby has a tongue tie. I'm just like, really? Like, help me. And I just burst into tears. And they're like, okay, what's going on? I told them, and they got a thermometer. And I was right. He had a fever. By this point, his breathing was getting, his respiratory rate was getting elevated. So he's starting to kind of show these bad signs. And the midwife realized that my milk was not coming in at all. And my nipples were completely shredded and flat. So at this point, these two midwives were like, we need to help you. They figured out the reason I was in so much pain was that I was allergic to endo. So I was breaking out in a rash, and it just wasn't doing anything for my pain. My milk was not coming in, which is quite normal for having a C-section. I found out, like, it can be delayed, but no one had told me that. No one had offered me a pump or done any support like that with me. And obviously my baby had a fever and was not doing so good. So she got me a pump, showed me how to start expressing colostrum. She got my frozen stash of colostrum that I brought in with me and just gave that all to him. And then she really nicely sat there and fed him a little bottle of formula and was explaining, like, you need to pump every 3 hours, we do this. And then NICU came and got him and took him to do some bloods to see if he had an infection, because I'd had that prolonged rupture of membranes.
And all of that happened when, like, you were saying from the beginning that something wasn't right. You were screaming at the midwives and they're telling you that he's overdressed. And no one actually ever checked his temperature when you're clearly saying he has a fever. That's... Wow. Yeah. Like, we
and
know
like,
that...
no one had sat with me.
Like, we just know from, doing studies that if you listen to, the patient, you listen to the mum, they will tell you what's wrong. And you were, like, that's a brilliant example of this. Like, you literally told them he has a fever. Yeah. And no one ever checked to, like, even if it was checking to tell you, oh, no, see, his temperature is fine. He's just overdressed, to, like, reassure you. That would have been good. Wow, like, that could have been picked up before, obviously. Wow. Yeah, the fact that no one explained to you what to expect, what would happen even in terms of your milk not coming in or being delayed in coming in. It would have been good for someone to, sit down with you and tell you all those things, not when you're having a mental breakdown, because things have accumulated, and you're trying to navigate this early, motherhood, and you're just not getting any help. That's wow. That's really sad.
And that's what I wanted to avoid. By having the home birth, I wanted to be able to be at home, be in a calm environment where I had everything around me, where my midwife would come and spend the time and, help me with breastfeeding and talk me through that, where my mum could come and sit with me, who's breastfed 2 babies, who could come and help me and go through those motions. Like, it's a huge adjustment becoming a mum, let alone like having to learn all those things for the first time, let alone recovering from a birth, whether it's vaginal or cesarean. But here I was, it's like, here's a baby. After major surgery, we'll see you every 4 hours for your drugs, basically.
That's just really sad that it happened to you, really. Like, the fact that, you got no help and they're just here to give you drugs. And that's it. No. So how was Ollie after he was taken to the NICU? How did he go, actually?
So he ended up being in NICU for nearly 3 hours overnight. And I remember having to ring my husband about 2 o'clock in the morning saying, our son is in NICU, but they're not letting you come in to be with me because it's after visiting hours. And him just having to wait at home for me to ring. But the pediatrician that was on, he was really nice. He came back and he was really honest. He was like, look, we had to give him a little bit of like this sweet thing, like sugary liquid thing, just to kind of settle him a little bit, because he was so dehydrated that they couldn't get a vein. And they'd ended up poking him about 12 times. He said to me, he's like, I know you're a new mum. You're going to go around and you're going to count. We poked him about 12 times until we could find a vein. It ended up being a really tiny little vein just in his ankle, and they had to splint his foot, and we had to be so careful not to knock it in case we knocked the cannula from the vein and blew it.
That's just that's so harsh for a newborn. He's like 2 days old at this point. Wow.
Yeah, and so they wanted to admit him to special care nursery, but the midwife who'd picked up the feeding issues and everything said, well, I'm quite happy to start him on his first lot of antibiotics right here with her while we figured out her plan and what we're doing, which I really appreciated. I didn't want to be separated from my baby.
Yeah, good. No, see, that's good that there are, professionals like that recognize that, at this stage and this early on, you need your baby and your baby needs you. And it's better if those things can happen. Obviously, if Ollie is clinically, stable. And, as she said, if he can be given antibiotics in the room with you, then, he's being treated, you've got him, and you're not stressing about your baby being away from you. How long did you guys stay in hospital for?
So after that, it was now Monday morning, and there was a push for him to be in the special care nursery and not in the maternity wings. And then I was pushing to get a single room, but they wouldn't do that either. And the family room was booked out by another family. So it was either stay in the maternity ward and go and visit him every 3 hours for feeds and then come back, or I could get discharged and go home and as I please and just spend all day at the special care nursery. So that's what I did. And he spent that entire first week in special care nursery. He had 2 antibiotics IV twice a day, I think it was. And then he had to have the Neostat because he was on the 2 really strong antibiotics just to make sure he didn't get thrush.
Oh, what a start to your motherhood, really. Wow.
Yeah.
How did it all go, I guess, after after you were discharged and also after Ollie was out of special care nursery? How did you settle into motherhood at this point after such a rough start? Not great. So I had spent the week in NICU triple feeding. So I would breastfeed, I would pump, and then I would top him up, which is insane. Like, it's horrible. And I kept saying to lactation consultants, well, I'm pumping everything for him. How do I wean him off these top-ups? And they kept saying, well, when he's only having breast milk, you can take him off the top-ups. But he was only having breast milk when I was there. So I was getting nowhere and I just wasn't feeling heard. And, I was spending I hadn't had a full night with my baby since he was born. So that was really off. But then we got home and it just deteriorated. I was sleeping in 1 hour increments because the feeding schedule was so grueling, trying to breastfeed him. And I had a lot of guilt
that because he was a cesarean baby, that I had to breastfeed because I needed him to have that. And because he had been in special care, like I felt like I owed him to be able to do this one thing right. Like it's, you know, your mind goes to mum guilt straight away. But he was getting more and more distressed, and I sent a video to one of my friends, the one that was at my birth, who had, you know, extended breastfed her first one, and I said, something's not right here. Like, I don't know what it is, but something's not right. You know, help me. And she's just like, no, he shouldn't be screaming like this. Like, something's wrong. You know, remember the midwife suggested he had a tongue tie. Like, let's take you to a different IBCLC. So I still couldn't drive. I think I was 2 weeks postpartum at this point. And so she came, picked us up, took me to this free walk-in clinic with an IBCLC. And they're just meant to do like minor things. And I started spilling my story, and she's like, okay, this is a little bit beyond the free clinic. I'll do you a deal. We'll go next door and we'll do a full appointment, full assessment, and I'll just do it for you half price. I'm like, okay, just help me, please. Like, I was on the verge of tears, and she knew this. And she took me next door and she saw a feed, and then she did an oral assessment. So in the NICU, the oral assessment by the pediatricians and the lactation consultants was putting on a glove, sticking a finger in his mouth and going, oh yeah, he's got a strong suck. The oral assessment with this IBCLC, she laid him down, she had the gloves on, she put that in and saw a strong suck, but then she opened his mouth, she tried to see how his tongue was moving, she felt his arch, she tested his gag reflex, just all these little things. And she's like, he has a really severe tongue tie, he's got a high arch palate, like he can't actually make a seal when he like to get any milk. Like, he's not getting anything from you. Everything he's getting is from the bottle, which is why he's so distressed, because he's not getting enough. And he's also taking in a lot of air, and then sleeping, he was mouth breathing. So, you know, his sleep quality wasn't great. She's like, you really need to have him assessed by the oral surgeon on our team and the speech pathologist as well. And I'm like, okay, great. What do I do until then? And she's just like, I would recommend exclusively pumping. Try and get him on the boob when you can tolerate, because obviously it really, really hurts, and just like for comfort really, and try and keep him interested. But just keep pumping. And then the appointment to see the surgeon and the speech pathologist wasn't for another 2 weeks. So, it was 4 weeks, because it was 6 weeks when I finally got to see them. So for the next however long, 4 weeks, I was exclusively pumping, which is almost as rough as triple feeding, because I'd have to pump round the clock every 3 hours and then still bottle feed him. But he immediately started settling down and was a lot more content, and I managed to get a little bit more sleep, but still not much. And then at 6 weeks we went in for the appointment, and the oral surgeon and the speech path saw him just like asleep up on my shoulder, and they're like, does he always sleep like that? And like, yeah, elevator's the only way that I can get him to sleep. And they said, because he can't breathe when he lays flat. So he had his tongue tie cut with scissors about 15 minutes after the consult. They both all did their own oral assessments within their fields, and they all unanimously agreed he really needed this done. And they cut it. He had a little cry for a minute. And we went back to the room, we sat down with the IBCLC, and she's like, just try and latch him. And he latched on perfectly. And I think anyone who's breastfed, the first time they latch and they get it, it's like this moment of going, oh, that's how it's meant to feel like. I remember just looking like, oh my God, this is what it's meant to be like. And she's like, yeah, that's perfect latch. Look, the tongue's out. He's not chewing. He's got the rolling movement. And from that point on, we breastfed until he was just over 2. So it wasn't until that he was 6 weeks that I kind of felt like I was in that postpartum bubble. Like, before that, it was like this weird survival. But after that, I could go home and I was getting more sleep as much as you can with a newborn, and nursing and just laying and cuddling and doing all of those things that you do as a first-time mum with your baby.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. And again, you had to fight so hard to get the right advice. Like, you're such a fighter, really. Like, it's just so striking that you didn't get the right advice, you didn't get the right professionals, and you had to fight your way into that IBCLC. And then from there on, you finally got the help you needed all along. And then you went on to breastfeed for 2 years. That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I had a bit of a friendship with the speech pathologist and the oral surgeon following that. He ended up needing some ongoing speech therapy because he had been so restricted in his mouth. He had never built up any sensory awareness. So he used to gag all the time when things would hit his gag reflex.
Oh.
Like he would gag himself all the time just with his fingers or even just nursing. And so we had to kind of build those senses up, especially before he started solids. And then later on, I ended up getting my own tongue tie cut by the same oral surgeon. And he was so happy to see Ollie, who was about 3 at the time, and just see how he'd grown, and was just like, wow, like his jaw and everything's come out like how they should be now. I'm like, yep, he's doing really well.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. I love hearing that. That is amazing. Wow. So you had a tongue tie as well. Was it bothering you too?
Nowhere near to the extent of Ollie's. It was the similar type, like the posterior tongue tie, which is where, like, if you push in under the tongue, you can kind of see it, but you can't normally see it when you look. And so when I was released, I felt all this tension just release in my jaw. Like it was so sore. And I was like, oh, wow, like this is like a big thing. No wonder he was so unhappy.
Wow. Oh, I've never heard of anyone as an adult getting a tongue tie released. I mean, you'd have to get it diagnosed to start with. But wow, that's amazing. And so how was, so as Ollie was getting older, were you thinking of having another child and expanding the family?
I wanted to. I always wanted to have more children. But after the experience of Ollie, like you could say, like the damage was done. Yeah. Like even after those 6 weeks when the tongue tie was released and I was getting sleep, like that experience in the hospital and the way that I was treated, like it really affected me. And I ended up having clinically diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder from his birth and really severe postnatal depression to the point that I think when he was around 6 months old, I was actually quite suicidal. And that was when I reached out for help for that.
Good.
So that kind of put off any thoughts of like when would have another child because, you know, I was in no state mentally and physically to go through with a pregnancy.
Well, and coming back to what you just said with having suicidal thoughts, what did you recognize that you needed help at that point, or was it your husband or your mum that maybe recognized that mentally you needed help?
I think my mum and my husband had picked it up early that I needed help, but I was sort of in denial. So it wasn't until I sort of had this moment where I was just so overwhelmed and I just left Ollie with my husband. I got in the car in my pajamas and just drove, and I just had this moment of going like, I don't want to be alive right now, and I realized like, oh, like I actually really need help, and that's when I reached out for help.
Wow, thank you so much for opening up about this, because I know that's not easy to say, and it's so important to talk about that, because it's so taboo these days to talk about mental health and say that we're not okay, and especially after what you've gone through, and especially, you know, your birth, your postpartum, everything's been really tough. So what form did help take for you? What sort of help did you get at this point?
So I went to a different GP than the one that I saw when I was pregnant with Ollie, and she's now my primary GP, and she's amazing, and I'm so thankful to have found her, even if the reason why I found her wasn't great. And she referred me to a local psychologist here in Hobart who specialises in birth trauma and was also a home birth mum herself. So that's her whole specialty. And so I did a lot of sessions with her, and we ended up doing a therapy called EMDR therapy, which is like, she described it as therapy on crack. It kind of seems like a hypnotherapy.
Okay, yeah.
But it's very intense. Like the days that you go through it, it brings up so much, and you just sob.
Yeah.
But then afterwards you just get this relief, and it just kind of desensitizes you to the triggers and helps your brain file away the traumatic memories to just not being in the forefront of your mind as like this instant fight or flight response. So I did a lot of that.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Wow. Did you also get medication as well, or was that not necessary?
No, I wasn't keen on medication, and my doctor as well. She was sort of like open to giving me medication, but she didn't want to give me medication without actually addressing the trauma.
Yeah.
She's like, I could give you drugs to your eyeballs, but it's not going to help the underlying cause. Like, you need to work through your experience.
Yeah. And see, that's really good to hear that your doctor was basically saying, you know, I can give you a Band-Aid, being a medication, but it's not going to help the actual cause of your mental health. And this is what you did. You worked through therapy, and that's really good to hear that, you know, your GP was like, well, I can, but there's obviously a deeper cause that needs to be addressed so that you can get better, and you can understand, you know, what's happening, and you can start figuring things out, and then you can learn to basically work through it yourself instead of just relying on a medication. I'm still so sorry to hear about, you know, everything that happened to you and that led you to you know, like having suicidal thoughts and needing this therapy. But good on you for addressing it, for working through therapy, because I'm sure it wasn't easy for you to show up and go through this, as you said, intense therapy. But it sounds like it really helped you to, I guess, move into the next chapter of your life and work through the trauma that you experienced. So what's on the cards for you now? So Ollie is 4?
Yeah, he just turned 4. Which is last week.
Oh, that is so good. Nice. Any thoughts on siblings or not yet?
That's a complicated one.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a complicated one. I would like a sibling for him, and he would definitely love a sibling.
Yeah.
But we've had some hiccups.
Yeah. And we don't have to go into that if you don't want to.
No, we can.
That's fine.
We can. So 18 months, when he was 18 months old, we had an unplanned pregnancy.
Yeah.
And I, with all my heart, desperately wanted to keep it.
Yeah.
But I didn't really have a lot of support around me, and there was a lot of concerns being raised about my health, because at this point I was really only just kind of coming out of therapy and being like a functional human being. As well as physically, I was not the greatest. You know, I'd had a pregnancy where I had hyperemesis and then a very intense birth and intense postpartum recovery, and then I breastfed. So I was really, really depleted. You know, physically I was going through postnatal depletion and was struggling with my iron and all that. I was not in a good way as much as I wanted to keep it. And there was a concern there, is just like, how are you going to handle another hyperemesis pregnancy when you're already struggling? And, you know, I found out very early that I was pregnant, but the hyperemesis kicked in earlier. So with Ollie, it had been 7 weeks. By 5.5 weeks, I was already vomiting. So we made the decision to have a termination. And it was medically classed as like a termination for medical reasons, because my health was not going to handle a pregnancy at that time, and wasn't even so much my physical health, but my mental health. It was just, you know, I just become functional, and then there was that big concern as if I go through this again now that I wouldn't function. So we did that, and then life being life, I initially wanted to try again when Ollie was about 2.5, 3, but living situations, moving house, COVID was another big thing that had happened. Like when I had the termination, it was 2020. The borders hadn't opened in Tassie, but we still had all those COVID restrictions, which was another element of coming to that decision of terminating was, you know, how would birthing in a hospital system in this time really be great after, you know, that horrible experience with my son.
Yeah.
So we waited. And then when I'd actually reached out to you to be on this podcast, I was newly pregnant with a very planned baby. Again, it had taken about 6 months. And from the time of filming this one, I had actually lost the baby. That was back in the end of November. And I'd had to have another surgical D&C. And then right after New Year's, I found out that the baby had actually been a partial molar pregnancy. So I'm in the throes of still being monitored for that, which throws a spanner in the works for future pregnancies now.
And I think told me when we spoke earlier that you actually found out you're more likely to have a molar pregnancy if you've got hyperemesis, which I didn't know about actually.
It's the other way around. So you're more likely to have hyperemesis if the pregnancy is molar. So
that's right.
The molar pregnancy, the trophoblasts cells in the placenta multiply rapidly. And depending on what type you have, they have different effects, but it raises your HCG really, really high, which then brings on really severe morning sickness. So that can actually be a sign of having a partial molar pregnancy, is having hyperemesis.
Wow. See, so obviously you got lucky with Ollie because he wasn't a molar pregnancy, but you still had hyperemesis. Wow. And so now you monitored. Are your HCG back to normal, or are they still elevated now?
Almost. So with the molar pregnancy, I found out at my dating scan at 9 weeks that the baby had stopped growing the week before at 8 weeks, and it was like a full little baby in the scan, but it didn't look quite right. Like, it's hard to explain. I think if you've seen scans of babies around, 8 weeks, 9 weeks, you kind of look and you say, oh, that's not quite. And I knew instantly that the baby wasn't okay because they didn't see that flicker of the heartbeat. There wasn't the little twitching and stuff. And that was really hard to go through because Ollie was with me at that scan and he had heard everything. So that's had to bring some big conversations up with a 4-year-old about, why is the baby not growing? But following that, I'm very thankful that I had a D&C rather than take the misoprostol pills, which is generally like what they push for miscarriages now, miscarriages, to take it at home so you don't have surgery, because the frontline treatment for a molar pregnancy is a D&C because they need to get all of that tissue out to avoid the cells continuing to multiply. And that's why they monitor your HCG, is to check that it is going down, because if it's going up, it means there was tissue left over and those trophoblast cells are multiplying.
Wow. So if those trophoblast cells are still multiplying, your body thinks you're pregnant, right?
Yeah, in a weird way. And so, they release HCG and those cells don't just stay in the uterus. They can actually spread to other areas of the body, and you will require chemotherapy to basically get rid of them. And if you're unfortunate enough to get a full molar pregnancy, which thankfully I did not, you have quite a high risk of that developing into a karyocarcinoma, which is a malignant form of the gestational trophoblastic disease.
So you can get cancer from pregnancy, or from initially trying to conceive. Wow, that's... Do you know what the difference is between a partial and a full molar pregnancy?
Yeah, so a full molar pregnancy is, to break it down, is like generally the egg that was fertilized didn't contain any DNA. and then
Okay.
it then multiplies and makes all those trophoblastic cells, and you get all of these different like cysts in your uterus. They describe it as like a snowstorm in there, so no fetus grows. It's just all these different cysts and tumours, and it's a lot riskier than having a partial molar pregnancy. The type that I had was a partial molar pregnancy, which meant the egg that was fertilized by 2 sperms. So it had 3 sets of DNA, which meant the baby would not have been incompatible with life. And most partial molar pregnancies don't survive past 3 months of pregnancy. And if they do happen to surpass and they realize that it's a molar pregnancy, because you'll start getting all of the cells and your HCG is really high and you'll get tumors and things like that, and the baby has a heartbeat, then you basically need to have a termination, because they need to get that tissue out and the baby won't survive anyway.
Wow, I'm so sorry to hear, about that. It's you obviously wanted to expand a family, have another baby, and then that it's traumatic to go through a miscarriage to start with, and then it's even more. It's devastating to then be told, oh, you have this almost life-threatening condition, I want to call it, that then means that you can't conceive until your HCG is back to normal, and you have to have all these monitoring, and it's obviously really stressful. And
yeah, so at first when I had the miscarriage, I remember saying to my GP, going, this is karma for having the termination. And she's like, it's not karma. It's just, it happens. Like, we don't talk about it enough, but it's super common. This was before we found out it was a molar pregnancy. And I kind of got back on my feet and recovered from the D&C, because that was start of December, and it was New Year's week, like first week of this year, that the hospital was calling going, you've got gestational trophoblastic disease. And I'm going, what on earth is that? And they told me over the phone, they said, it's partial molar, the baby had 3 sets of chromosomes, it never would have survived. I'll send you through a fact sheet, but you need to go and get your HCG tested every week just to make sure it's normal. I was like, oh, okay. And then I read the fact sheet that goes through going, oh, you might need chemotherapy if your HCG doesn't go down. I'm like, hold on, you missed a lot of things off this conversation. So I did a lot of research, but thankfully, I mean, it's kind of like a blessing. I got answers for the miscarriage, which puts a lot of peace. But at the same time, I've heard molar pregnancies being described as the miscarriage that doesn't end, because, this miscarriage happened in November and it's now almost the end of January, and I'm still having to go to the pathologist every Friday to have blood drawn. And can't even plan another pregnancy or try until I get signed off from that clinic. And even then I'm getting conflicting information from the obstetricians. Some say, once you're cleared, you've had your 3 consecutive 0 readings of HCG, you can start trying. And then others are saying, no, you need to wait until it's been 6 months from the D&C, but that's generally the rule of thumb for a full molar. But then this obstetrician saying I need to do that for a partial molar. So I think even then, it's because it's a rare thing, it's hard to get proper information.
I'm so sorry you're going through all of that. That's so hard. I hope you're doing okay and you're getting the support you need during this time.
Yeah, I am. I've got my friends have been really lovely and just kind of working through the emotions, and there's some really good online Facebook groups that I reach out and go, hey, I've got this, and they can kind of talk about their experiences. It's just hard to wrap your head around. So the chance of having a molar pregnancy at all is 1 in 1,000. And then once you've had a molar pregnancy, the chance of having another molar pregnancy is 1 in 70. And it doesn't necessarily mean if I have another pregnancy and I get another molar pregnancy that it'll be a partial molar. It could be a complete molar. And that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, going, well, I was 1 in 1,000 this first time. What are the chances of me being the 1 in 70 next time?
Wow. I didn't know that, actually. That I was going to ask if you were at more risk, but I thought probably not. But wow. Have you found a support group for people that have had molar pregnancies? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, there's an international one called My Molar Pregnancy. There's an there's a trying to conceive one called like After My Molar Pregnancy, and then there's an Australian one called My Molar Pregnancy Australian Group or something like that. Wow. And throughout Australia there's different things. In Queensland and I think Victoria they actually have gestational trophoblastic disease registries, so you get on there and you have a lot of like follow-up. In Tassie you just sort of deal with whatever obstetrician's on.
Okay. Well, it's good that there is support, because at least you can ask, you know, other moms that maybe have gone through what you've gone and maybe have conceived and had a healthy baby and a healthy pregnancy. But wow, that's insane. So I guess it's hard to then know if, you know, I guess where you stand in terms of, do you try again to have another baby? I guess knowing the risks, you'd be heavily monitored, I'm guessing, from the get-go. And so potentially that would be picked up maybe earlier.
Technically, so because I've had a molar pregnancy, any subsequent pregnancies now, I need to have an early dating scan around between 6 and 8 weeks. I recommend is 6. And that's specifically to pick up whether it's a complete molar, because I won't be growing a baby, there'll be cysts growing. I think reading in the group, some people opt to have a few more scans throughout that first trimester just to check things, and they can do quantifying like blood tests, but that won't define a molar pregnancy alone unless it's like a complete molar and your HCG is skyrocketing high. And then post any pregnancy, whether it becomes a healthy baby, a stillbirth, a miscarriage, a termination, at 6 weeks postpartum, they have to track my HCG. It's back to normal. Yeah, but other than that, you're not treated as a high-risk pregnancy.
Okay. That's a lot to think about, consider, and a lot for you to digest when you just wanted to have another baby. Wow.
Yeah, it is. It was a lot at the time, and now I'm sort of a lot better with it. I remember at the time going, I just wanted to have a baby, and now I'm potentially going to need to go through chemotherapy. And at the time, I didn't know what my HCG was, and I was still testing positive. I went out and got urine HCG test, and I was still testing positive. And I was going, oh my God, I'm going to have chemotherapy. But thankfully, my last 2 HCG draws have been below 5, which is what my hospital classifies as negative. Some classify as 0, some are below 5. So hopefully, if I can get one more negative, I'll be signed off.
Oh, okay. That's great news for you. Wow. And then you can start breathing and moving on from this chapter and seeing the light, I guess.
Yeah, like that's the thing. You rock up to a pathology with the form saying quantitative HCG, and they're like, "Oh, how far along are you?" I'm like, "Well, actually, I'm not pregnant at all." You know, this is monitoring to make sure I don't have a type of cancer, basically.
See that's so harsh. Like, I know the pathologist is trying to build a rapport and be enthusiastic, but that's harsh.
Yeah, I've been really good. I've been going every Friday. I've got the same pathologist. So after that first appointment, he was good. But one of them, I had to see a different one. And she said, I was like, no, it was a molar pregnancy. She's like, oh, what? Like, yeah, I hadn't heard of it either.
Yeah, I think I first heard of it like maybe 2 months ago. Same on a podcast. And I had no idea what it was until the mom described it. And I went, oh, wow. Like, I think I'd maybe seen the name, but I didn't associate it with being, what it is, right? And I didn't realize the extent of it. And when the mom described her experience, I went, oh, wow. And then hearing your experience, I learned things I didn't even know, because I didn't know the difference between a full and a partial molar. I'm really happy to hear that you're almost there. That's great. But what a process since November. Wow, it's a long time.
Yeah, because it was, I think, I found out the baby had died at 9 weeks, and I didn't get to have the D&C until like 2 weeks later.
Oh, wow.
And my belly was still growing.
Oh.
I remember taking a photo going, I still have, I have a full-on bump You know, I sent it to friends going, I have a full-on bump, but the baby's dead. And like now that I know it was a molar pregnancy, I'm like, oh, that's why it was still growing, because trophoblastic tissue was still growing.
It's so harsh, and thank you so much for telling about this, because yeah, it's something I didn't know about. Like, I didn't know it in that much depth, and I'm sure it will help, you know, people that, you know, to at least be informed and know what it is. And for people that are going through it, it helps to know that they're not the only one, because I mean, it sounds like 1 in 1,000 is not, it's not rare. Like, it's not
Yeah, it
uncommon.
doesn't sound rare, but apparently it is actually quite rare. Yeah, I don't know anyone else who's had it besides in the support groups.
Oh, wow.
But it was just, I found it interesting because from the moment I knew that the baby was gone, I had in my mind, I'm having a D&C. Like, that was my gut instinct, have a D&C.
Yeah.
And that is the first line treatment. Like, that's what you need if you have a molar pregnancy. You need to have a suction D&C.
Yeah.
And part of my reasoning for that was because I'd had a medical termination in the past. I knew that procedure. I felt comfortable with the risks of that. And going through that, I was not comfortable because I'd gone through all of that between having the Mistral and the suction D&C. So in a way, because I had that termination, it's probably saved me, you know, a much more horrible time this time around, because I probably would have taken the pills otherwise. Yeah. But then again, I might not have been in this situation if I hadn't have had a termination in the past. So it's a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, you said it before, it's not karma. You didn't have a molar pregnancy because of karma. You terminated a pregnancy. That was your choice. You have a choice to do it. You don't even need to explain yourself, you know. Whether it's for mental health reasons, it's for physical reasons, it's for financial reasons, it's because you don't want to have a baby, you're not ready to have one, you don't want to have any more. It's valid. It doesn't matter what the reasoning is, and there's no such thing as a karma for having a termination. Yeah, and I've had conversations with some of the women in the molar pregnancy groups who have discovered that they've had a partial or a full molar pregnancy once they've actually gone to have a termination for a pregnancy that they couldn't continue for whatever reason. Yeah. And now they're having to go through the process of dragging it out. And, you know, it's mentally, it's a lot. Like, they didn't want to be having a pregnancy for whatever reason, and now they've got this condition that they have to think about in the present and have the HCG draws, or some of them have ended up on chemotherapy. But also have that in the back of their mind for any future pregnancies. Like, they always have to think about the fact that they've had that termination, because they have to bring up the fact that they've had a, you know, gestational trophoblastic disease. Wow, that's insane. Like, there's such a burden to carry, like, and you know, when you want to conceive and you want to, you know, have another baby, you don't want to think about that, obviously. But thank you so much. It's been so good to hear about molar pregnancy and understand the depth of it, because I did not understand it went this deep, and it will affect your future, obviously. And it's been very informative for me, so thank you so much. And I really hope that the future brings you whatever you want, and it's brighter on the other side. Thank you. No, I think there's another baby in the future. It's just a matter of when and how. And I'm sure that if it's meant to be, it'll happen in its own time. But at least when I do go down that path, I have so much more knowledge to take with me from all the past experiences that I've been through. So I have good hopes that my next pregnancy and birth will be a more positive one, no matter how it may look. I'm sure you've learned heaps, like more than a healthy pregnancy, I guess, would teach you. So unfortunately, but I mean, you're educated at least. So thank you so much again. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to get notified of when a new episode comes out, please subscribe to this show on your podcast listening platform. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast, or share this episode so that other moms can find it. If you would like to tell your own pregnancy, birth, or parenting story, please head to the show notes and you will find a form there to get in touch with me. Again, thank you so much for listening. and I will be with you again next week for a new episode.